Hi everybody, it's Julessa again, and in this video we're going to talk a little bit more about soldering. We're going to go into a detail about the different types of flames, the different types of solder, and then finally I'm going to show you a neat trick with pick soldering, because I know I had a question last week about having trouble with the solder sticking to the pick or not coming off the pick when they're trying to put it on the joint. So let's go to the bench and get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is your flame. The flame is one of the most important parts of soldering, and if you have too much oxygen in it or too much gas in it, you're not going to be able to solder very well. It's going to take a long time. So let's go ahead and light the torch and we'll talk to you about the flame. So you want to light the flame by turning on the gas first. Get it to a nice length of orange flame like you're seeing here, and then add your oxygen to it until you get to a neutral flame. And you can see here there's still a little bit of orange in my flame here, or yellow, and that's just a little bit too much gas, so we want to add oxygen to it. And now you see a larger blue cone, a smaller middle or inner cone, and then just a tiny bit of the little orange flame in there, and that's what we call a neutral flame. And that means we have equal amounts of oxygen and gas, and that will give you the best heat for your soldering and reduce the amount of oxidation that happens on your piece. So remember, blue flame, cone, and the centerpiece right here is just tiny bit of yellow. Now if you have too much gas, it's going to look like this, or too much oxygen, I should say. It'll look like that, and that's going to cause a little bit more oxidation to your piece than you probably want, because you're going to have to put the heat on the metal long enough to get the solder to flow, and this can cause a little bit extra oxidation. Now if you have too much gas, you'll see a yellow cone in here, and that means you've got what we call a reducing flame, which is great for annealing, but you don't want to use that for your solder because it takes too long to heat up the metal, which in turn causes oxidation. The other thing I want to mention about flame is, depending on the size of your piece, you need to adjust the flame for the size. If it's a small, tiny, delicate piece, you want to use a smaller, more delicate flame. And by that I mean, let's turn this off and see how long my flame is here. This is the assumption I'm going to work on a very large piece. I want to work on a small piece, so I'm going to turn my flame down. I'm going to add some oxygen to it for a neutral flame. A little bit lower. And this is a small flame for something small, like soldering on an ear wire or balling up your metal to create granules, depending on how small they are. This has the same amount of heat as a larger flame. The only difference being that this is less likely to melt all of the piece around your solder joint, especially when you're working on small items. If you want to work on a larger item, you add more gas to it, make a larger flame, and create a larger cone and a larger blue flame. And what that will do is help you heat up the metal fast, get the soldering done, and then get out of the piece as quick as possible. And that also reduces the amount of oxidation that happens on your metal. One of the other things that I think is really important to understand is where in the flame is the most concentrated heat. Out here in your flame, it's hot. Don't get me wrong, it's going to burn you, and eventually it will solder, but it will take a long period of time, and you don't want to be in too long because of the oxidation, and you also don't want to be too hot and get in too quickly and get out too quickly, because that will also potentially cause your metal to melt, and you don't want that. So the best part of your flame is about 1/4 inch or maybe a centimeter between the inner cone and the outer flame. So right about here. I usually try and solder within 1/4 to 1/2 inch, or roughly 1/2 to a full centimeter if I want to work on getting in and getting out fast. And that's generally the standard operations for soldering. You want to get in as quickly as possible. So that is the flame. And one other thing about flames. You want to make sure that you use the flame to its best by, one, keeping a neutral flame, meaning equal amounts of gas and oxygen. You want to be able to heat your piece quickly, solder, and get out based on the size of your flame. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're using the hottest part of the flame to be able to get in and out. One other thing I'd like to note is that your flame is going to cause a lot of yellow light, and that's going to make it difficult for you to see in the long run. I know this from personal experience, so I would highly recommend getting yourself a pair of these. These are lamp workers glasses, and it's designed to help cut down and reduce on the yellow UV rays that come from your flame. Normally it's for lamp working because they're working inside the flame and looking directly into it to create glass beads. But I use these to do my soldering because I can get rid of the yellow glare from the soldering torch and be able to see exactly on my joint where I'm soldering. So I highly recommend getting these. They'll run you anywhere from $30 to $75 plus, but it's worth it in the long run, especially have light colored eyes. We have a tendency to be more sensitive to light. So this is one of the safety gears that I definitely recommend. So the next thing I want to talk about is solders. They come in lots of different hardnesses and different types as far as wire, pallion, and sheet. So I wanted to go briefly over those. First, let's talk about the types of solder. There is extra hard, hard, medium, easy, and extra easy. And each one of these different types of solder contains a different amount of a silver content, which ultimately raises the melting temperature. So if you're using hard solder, the melting temperature is roughly about 1300 to 1400 degrees, which means you're going to have to get your metal up to almost melting point to get the solder to flow, which with the practice of flame control and heat, getting in and getting out, you'll be able to do that with no problem. Then there's medium solder. Medium solder, as it kind of indicates, is a little bit less silver content, a little bit lower melting point, which means you can get in and get out just as quickly as with hard solder, but it has a lower melting point, so it'll be a little bit faster. The other thing about solder too is you have to understand the order of operations. So if you have multiple pieces and you're trying to solder, let's say 6 pieces together, and you've got 6 different joints that you're going to be using, you want to figure out which joints you can separate and solder with hard solder first, and then ultimately put them together with medium solder. And that takes a little bit of practice. It's something that you'll learn over time, but I highly recommend starting with hard solder as much as possible and then moving to medium. I personally don't use easy solder very much because I've been able to kind of come up with a system to be able to hard solder as much as I possibly can and then put things together either with hard solder or medium solder. It all depends on the piece. The next thing I want to tell you about is the different styles of solder, and that means the different types of ways you can purchase it. You can purchase it in sheet, which comes in a little sheet like this, and you can use a solder cutter or pliers, or wire cutters I should say, to cut off small little pallions and use for your soldering project. You also have wire solder, which is what I use the most frequently, and what I do with this is I'll cut a little piece off, hammer it flat so it doesn't roll around anywhere, and then cut it with my solder cutters and keep a supply of that at hand while I'm working. And last but not least, or I guess it's not last but not least, but you can also buy them in pre-cut pallions. And I have this in an old makeup container. Let me get this open. And as you can see here, they're already pre-cut. So all I have to do is take a few pieces out, ball them up, and then solder my piece together. This takes a little bit of practice because there's such tiny pieces that sometimes you have to use 2 or 3 in order to get enough solder to solder the joint. But at the same time, it generally will keep you from putting too much solder on the joint and end up with a lot of overflow that you have to clean up later. And the last type of solder is what we call a paste solder. And unfortunately, I don't have any of the paste solder. I used all the stuff that I had. But it basically is the solder mixed in with the flux. I still recommend using flux outside of the paste solder just to make sure that your metal is completely protected from the oxidation. But it comes in a little syringe, and you can use the syringe to put the solder right on your joint, heat it up, and then the solder will flow. Last, I wanted to talk about a quick tip about pick soldering. When you're pick soldering, sometimes you can heat up the solder and try and pick it up with the pick, and it always falls off. And that's kind of frustrating because you've got the metal up to temperature and you're ready to go, and then you can't get the solder to stick to your pick. So what I like to do is, let me light the torch. Get my torch ready. Heat, heat, heat. Then I go to pick up my solder and it won't stick. It keeps staying on the board. So what I do is I take my solder pick and I dip it in the flux, heat it up, then pick up my solder ball. And as you can see, it's sticking right on there. This also helps with the release of the solder onto your piece. Let's put this little piece of copper down here. So now I'm ready to solder. I've got my heat going, and I want my solder to stick to the metal. As I'm placing it on the metal, I'm heating up the flux, which actually releases the solder ball. So this is taking a little bit long. I didn't heat my metal up enough. But solder, there goes the solder flow. So that's one little trick to help you with pick soldering, is put a little flux on your pick, heat it up and let it turn glassy, then pick up your solder and then place it on your joint, and you'll have a much easier time getting that solder onto the joint while you're pick soldering. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if so, give me a like. If you have questions or comments, leave them down below the video. I'd love to answer them. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.